Both wars created a labor shortage that African Americans were happy to fill. But as World War II came to an end and white workers began returning home, this was set the stage for conflict between these two groups. As black families moved to new neighborhoods and the economy changed, these tensions would escalate as Detroit's golden age came to an end.
In the 1940s, Detroit was a glimmering example of how World War II was lifting the country further out of recession. The auto industry, turned wartime industry, provided many in Detroit with a newfound social mobility as there seemed to be more jobs than there were people to take them. Women were stepping into factories to do work more commonly done by men, and the city saw racial demographics begin to shift as black Americans migrated into the city. From 1940 to 1950, the black population more than doubled. In an attempt to account for housing for the shifting demographics of Detroit, the federal government elected to build a vast housing projects in predominantly white areas. Black families jumped at the opportunity to upgrade their standard of living. Their hopes of progress would soon be met with clashes from white communities. Whites balked at the idea of living side by side with black communities. Tensions boiled over at the Sojourner Truth housing projects in 1942. Angry white mobs surrounded families and blocked entrances in an attempt to intimidate families away from housing projects. When things got violent, police made runs into the melee. Police intervention was rarely helpful, as most police sided with the white mobs and arrested scores of black families. Riots would again envelop the city in 1943, as police would kill 19 rioters, often shot in the back, and not a single white participant. Racial tensions in post-war Detroit would continue to take center stage in a city with a thriving economy and middle class, still home to the largest auto industry in the world. As the black pilgrimage continued and shifted from inner city to the suburbs, whites continued to react violently. In 1945 and 1946, there were more than 200 acts of white-on-black violence, with the bulk of them stemming from families moving into white neighborhoods. As whites pushed back against black housing, police continued to land blow after blow against the black community. The Michigan Chronicle decried that police brutality became the symbol of everything wrong with Detroit. Police brutality and police violence would become a rare source of unity for the city after the beating and shooting of Leon Mosley by white police officers in 1948. Reverend T.S. Boone of King Solomon Baptist, future Mayor Coleman Young, the NAACP, the Civil Rights Congress, the Communist Party, the Congress of Industrial Union Council, and United Auto Workers all banded together to demand justice for Leon Mosley. They did not succeed. According to an unnamed former black police officer, white cops did it just for kicks, just for fun. Beating black citizens in transitioning neighborhoods just for fun indicated the degree to which racism had infected the mentality of many white policemen. The practice was designed to intimidate and terrorize the black community into accepting white dominance in the neighborhoods.
With reference to Detroit's non-white population, it had grown from 150,000 in 1940 to 303,000 in 1950 to 487,000 in 1960. Despite the consistent growing numbers of the non-white community, by 1960, only 15.6% of the African American population lived in predominantly white neighborhoods. This percentage decreased from the 30% that lived in these neighborhoods during 1940. The growing population of African Americans, combined with the decrease in inclusive neighborhoods, reflected the growing ecological separation of the black and white communities. Another example of the growing separation of the black and white communities was seen in the increase in suburban segregation. By 1960, only 3% of Detroit's African American community lived in a suburban neighborhood. This occurred at a time when America's suburban areas were experiencing the greatest mass housing construction and population shifts of the 20th century. Not only did the existing black community of Detroit continue to experience segregation, but African Americans who moved to Detroit were subject to it immediately. Enforced by bodily threats and restrictive real estate covenants, incoming African Americans were barred from living almost anywhere other than the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods that ran up east of Woodward Avenue. This effectively split the east and west parts of Detroit. Additionally, Paradise Valley was subject to the interstate highway projects that placed a freeway down the center of Paradise Valley, displacing thousands of African Americans and further congesting the black tenements. The 1950s also saw many auto industry workers losing their jobs. Automation and the increasing foreign competition were creating hardships on Detroit's auto companies like Packard, who had to close their factory in 1956. The closed factory was left to rot and gather dust, effectively pulling down the east side of Detroit. By 1958, 20% of the Detroit workforce were unemployed. With the growing racial tension caused by the city's segregation and workforce situation, civil rights leaders began to voice their concerns. On November 10, 1963, Malcolm X delivered one of his most famous speeches in Detroit, known as the Message to the Grassroots. In this speech, Malcolm X commented on the growing tensions of the black and white communities in Detroit.
We have a common enemy. We have this in common. We have a common oppressor, a common exploiter, and a common discriminator. So once we all realize that we have this common enemy, then we unite on the basis of what we have in common. And what we have foremost in common is that enemy, the white man. He's an enemy to all of us. I know some of you all think that some of them aren't enemies. Time will tell.
Although this speech was presented in 1963, it was a precursor of what was to come. The culmination of the growing suburban segregation, Detroit's workforce environment, and the outward dissatisfaction of civil rights leaders led to an outward public uprising known as the 1967 Race Riots of Detroit.
The growing separation of the community of Detroit set the stage for the Race Riot of 1967. The riot lasted for 3 days. There was a rift within the community, causing the establishment of segregated bars. The African American community sought after unlicensed bars, also known as speakeasies or blind pigs. A speakeasy, named the United Community League for Civil Action at Economy Printing on 12th Street, was raided on July 23, 1967. The 12th Street location was targeted because it was a predominantly black area. At 3:45 a.m., an officer named Joseph Brown went to check on the operational status of the speakeasy. Brown found a party where 2 returning vets with 82 people in attendance. The raid arrested the party, and while waiting for backup to transport the group, a crowd began to gather around 4:05 a.m. The crowd became more and more upset, beginning to unify and move down 12th Street. The crowd began looting and destroying the area, and by 8:30 a.m., the street disturbance started to spread. By 9 a.m., the crowd grew to 8,000, and police began to seal off the neighborhood. Looting began to head into white neighborhoods such as 7 Mile and Woodward and Michigan and Junction. By the end of the first day, liquor sales were banned in Detroit, Hamrick, Highland, and Harlan Park. The National Guard was called into the streets of Detroit. The fire department had to request help from suburban fire stations because of the multiple fires that were raging throughout the city. On Monday, July 24th, 1967, Detroit, Hamrick, Highland Park, and Escrows and River Rouge were declared in a state of emergency by Governor George Romney. Looting continued into the next morning. Police reported 400 people had been injured. The cycle of fires continued, and looting continued to rage, with 26 fires reported in the Woodward area. The situation escalated to the point where FBI Chief John Edgar Hoover said they have lost all control in Detroit. On midnight on Tuesday, July 25th, 1967, President Johnson announced that paratroopers headed into Detroit. Cops and National Guard shot civilians in response to the riots. Julius Dorsey, a Detroit security guard, was caught between crossfire of police and looters and lost his life. After this incident, General Tacoma ordered all Army and National troops to unload weapons and load only with permission. Wednesday, July 26, 1967, was punctuated by the killing of 6 people, including a murder of a congresswoman, Helen Hall. Hall was shot and killed by a sniper from her hotel. Tanya Blanning, Albert Robinson, and George Tobin were also killed, all by the National Guard. The 1967 riots scared the population of Detroit and demonstrated the culmination of the cultural and racial divide that had been brewing in Detroit for decades. It's important to note that most of the damage occurred in black communities and then expanded into white areas. This riot changed the fabric of the city and caused racial strife into the following decades.
Although the 1967 riots in Detroit drastically altered the overall state of the city, it was the events that ensued after the riots that contributed to the image of Detroit that people know today. Detroit had fallen victim to racial and class tensions that foreshadowed the future of the city and its inhabitants. The racial and class division began to set the foundation for what was going to become a tumultuous future for the city of Detroit. Post-1967 Detroit saw dramatic shifts in the primary demographic of the city, along with changes in the city's politics and industry, all of which had an impact on Detroit's urban crisis. Despite Detroit previously priding itself on what Suzanne Smith describes as its reputation as a model city of race relations, the aftermath of the riots told a different story in regard to the shift in the city's demographic. The images of death and chaos from the riots sent blacks and whites into a panic. There was an overwhelming feeling of concern and paranoia about any future riots that may take place that were as devastating as the riot in 1967. However, it was the white communities that expressed the largest amount of concern over the possibility of future rioting. This sentiment was echoed throughout the predominantly white communities of Southfield, Livonia, Royal Oak, and Dearborn. When members of these neighborhoods were asked what they believed the most significant causes of the riots were, the top answers were black nationalism, criminal elements, and lack of jobs. With this in mind, the white population in Detroit began to relocate to the suburbs, taking factories, jobs, and tax dollars with them to areas like Warren. As white middle-class families began to settle in their suburban ranch-style, colonial, split-level, and development structures, the black population was being subjected to new slums that were now being nurtured in these adjacent neighborhoods as poor people are permitted to overcrowd and overuse the housing units, and as landlords exploit their properties through zoning variances, ineffective code enforcement, and minimal maintenance. In addition to the white flight that was taking place in Detroit after the 1967 riot, the political and industrial climate changed as the black community faced post-rebellion conflict with Detroit's City Hall. Detroit Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh, along with other Detroit politicians, sought to address the issues of urban crisis and the impact that it would have for insurance companies in the city. Civil unrest had prompted insurance companies to abandon the city because they were losing money due to civil disorders. The focal point of these problems was on the black community and how the government could effectively remove them from the inner city in order to maintain the presence of the insurance companies. Kavanaugh proposed that, quote, more emphasis should be placed on making rural life more attractive to Negroes, even if it requires a back-to-the-land movement. This was met with heavy criticism from Detroit's black leadership and local civil rights groups, and an alternate proposal by the Milton and Richard Henry's Malcolm X Society. Their plan was to improve the lives of blacks in Detroit by providing better housing and community centers, fully equipped with educational facilities and recording studios. But despite both proposals, it was still unclear and highly disputed what the future image of Detroit was going to look like. 5 years after the riots had taken place, political control of the city had turned to the hands of the black community as they elected Detroit's first black mayor, Coleman Young. Mayor Young seemed like a promising and necessary change not only for the city, but for Detroit's black community. Young was vengeful, intelligent, and quickly asserted his authority with a no-nonsense attitude towards getting Detroit back on the right track. In his inaugural address, Young said, "I issue a forward warning now to all those pushers, to all rip-off artists, to all muggers. It's time to leave Detroit. Hit 8 Mile Road, and I don't give a damn if they are black or white, or if they wear Superfly suits or blue uniforms with silver badges. hit the road. Mayor Young appealed greatly to the black community while making whites feel as though they were not welcome in the city. But unfortunately, things did not work out as well for blacks as they had hoped. During Young's time as mayor, he was held responsible for the exiling of the middle class to the suburbs, the emergence of influential drug-dealing gangs, and the overall increase in crime rate. As a bartender at a VFW in Detroit recalled of Young's time in office, "The blacks wanted out of the ghetto, and now the whole city's a ghetto. Young ruined that city."
Later, in the 1980s, a deep economic depression hit Detroit, caused by the continued decline of the American auto industry. As Americans began switching from American-made cars, which had gotten the reputation of being unreliable, to newly dependable Japanese-made cars, racial tensions continued to develop. However, these racial tensions were not between the white and African American populations, but rather between the white and Asian communities. As the emotions and the loss of jobs began to rise, angry Detroit citizens created a habit of shooting at Japanese-made cars as they passed by. The racial tensions accumulated on June 19, 1982, when Vincent Chin was murdered because of his ethnicity. A fight had broken out between the 43-year-old Ronald Ebbins and his stepson, 23-year-old Michael Nitz, against Vincent Chin. As eyewitness reports state, once Ebbins and Nitz managed to chase down Chin, Nitz held him down while Ebbins swung a baseball bat at full force and proceeded to beat Mr. Chin to death. Ebbins was under the impression that Vincent Chin was Japanese, but on the contrary, he was of Chinese descent. On March 18, 1983, both Ebbins and Nitz pled guilty and were charged with first-degree murder. However, their punishment would surprise the entire city. Judge Charles Koofman decided the pair would only serve 3 years of probation and pay a fine of $3,000 each. Koofman would go on to explain his decision, stating that it is clear that Chin threw the first punch, and although it went beyond the standard actions of self-defense because of both of their previous clean history and position in the community, it is unlikely that the pair pose a further threat to society. This verdict created a public uproar. Prominent newspapers like the Detroit Free Press and Mission Chronicle, the largest African American weekly in Michigan, ran articles that criticized Koofman's decision. The most important aspect of the murder of Vincent Chin is that both Ebbins and Nitz were white males that had held jobs at the American car factories that were at risk of closing. They had felt the economic shift that was happening all around them. With the movement to Asian-manufactured cars, their sense of security was removed. Ebbins specifically held the same position as a supervisor for 18 years at one of the manufacturers. This attribute, in the eyes of Judge Koofman, had made him fitting for a lighter punishment. All the while, both men were being fed propaganda against the incoming Asian Americans, making them see the Japanese now as an enemy and a scapegoat for their economic troubles. It wouldn't have mattered if either man knew that Vincent Chin was actually Chinese, because they had already made up their mind that justice needed to be served. By having scenarios like Vincent Chin, we're able to see racial tensions weren't just between the white and African American communities, but with all different minority groups.
During hard times when people were getting laid off, scapegoating African Americans was a common tactic used to deflect blame from the auto industry. Racist tensions towards the Japanese Americans were ignited due to foreign competition. Resentment towards Asian Americans was rampant, and this led to the murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American. The city's heavy reliance on the automobile industry was directly tied to the economic decline it had experienced over the years. Racial tensions in Detroit were ignited by the auto industry. Throughout the decades, Detroit has experienced fluctuating economic conditions. Economic growth and job opportunities allowed African Americans to achieve social mobility, much to the dismay of the white population and the police. For some of the white population, living in the same neighborhood as affluent African Americans was uncomfortable and inappropriate, thus creating white mobs and police brutality directed towards African Americans in Detroit. In conclusion, the city of Detroit served as an important landscape in the establishment of civil rights in the United States. With the establishment of the auto industry, the continuous growth of suburban developments, and the racial tensions boiling over into the streets, many eyes were on Detroit during the 19th century. Today, Detroit still holds the nickname that was given to it during the golden age of the American automotive: Detroit, the Motor City.